Hello and welcome to this look at Chapter 7, the changing metro landscape in the post-World War II era. We're going to look at three really important factors when discussing how cities changed in the mid to late 1900s. Our focus today will be primarily on American cities, but we also need to acknowledge that a lot of these older industrial cities in other countries, primarily Western Europe, experienced similar changes during this time. The first factor that we need to discuss was covered in our previous chapter, and that was the ascension of the suburbs. You'll recall that suburbs, in conjunction with highway investment, allowed people to move outside of the downtown areas. What we found was that our suburbs were more prosperous than our downtown areas. So people were moving for a new life, a new community. Businesses soon followed. The investment in highways allowed this to happen at a much more rapid and efficient pace. We also recognize redlining, where many of our American residents, American citizens, were not able to leave the downtown areas that lacked investment, at least from the time until the late 1960s. We saw how covenants in the years immediately after World War II limited who could go where, and how the de jure or legal form of segregation led to long-term de facto or cultural forms of segregation. So these impacts, the investment in the suburbs of our older industrial cities, led to the further decline of the central business district, led to greater metropolitan prosperity, but again, most of this was happening on the outside. But what still remained positive was that through the 1960s, our older cities, our industrial cities, primarily in the Northeast and the Great Lakes regions of the United States, they maintained their manufacturing base, providing tens of thousands of jobs in the cities, providing a tax base that would support municipal services like schools and roads and crime prevention. So there was still a healthy economy in our older industrial cities during this time, even though most of the more affluent residents, the middle class, was moving to the outer areas. Another issue, or threat in this case, to our older industrial cities was federal investments, and we'll see how the federal investments changed the landscape in the post-World War II era. And a third would be deindustrialization, the movement of manufacturing out of our cities into other parts of the country and eventually overseas. So these three factors contribute to the changing metro landscape in the post-World War II era. When we look at the location of our U.S. defense bases, the Northeast had historically been the site of these bases. In the post-World War II era, we saw a lot of our bases move into the Sun Belt and then eventually the West Coast. So cities like San Diego, the LA metro area, Austin, San Antonio, Texas, Tennessee, these areas all found massive federal investment. So we had an investment in jobs. We had the pull factor to draw people out of the Northeast into these areas, especially places in New Mexico and Arizona that were deemed inhospitable now became destinations with this federal investment. So the federal government deciding where to invest its money created a growth pull, a pull factor that encouraged people to move to these places to take advantage of different career opportunities and also new exciting locations for their families. So when we look at this triple threat, as we'll call it, to older industrial cities, again, we see suburbanization, federal investment in the Sun Belt, and deindustrialization. These three forces had a very strong collective long-term effect on our older industrial cities. We look at a few of these cities. The one on the left is the population of Baltimore. And you can see where Baltimore peaked around 1950 and then declined through the current decade. We see a similar trend in Cleveland, again peaking in 1950, the census immediately after the World War II era, and Detroit as well. We see Detroit peaking in 1950. So these data sets show us that this is not a random set of occurrences, right? The collective impact of suburbanization, federal investment in the Sun Belt, and deindustrialization created this push and pull factor, pushing people out of our older industrial cities and pulling them into these exciting new opportunities in the Sun Belt. The the map on your screen shows where our cities are growing the fastest, and you notice since 2010, none of our cities on this list sit in the Northeast or the Great Lakes regions. And you'll see again the Sun Belt: Atlanta, Fort Worth, Austin, Denver, Charlotte, Raleigh. Later on, the investment in technology attracted people to Seattle. So again, not a surprise that we're recognizing these patterns 70 plus years after World War II. So what we need to recognize in this era is that cities and metros constantly change. The broad forces that we discussed, suburbanization, deindustrialization, federal investment in the Sun Belt, attracted people elsewhere. So we saw this broad decline in our older industrial cities, and we saw a boom happening in the Sun Belt. Now, the American economy was strong during this time, and cities remained the centers of investment, but we saw a shift drawing people again from the Northeast and Great Lakes into the Sun Belt, towards the West Coast. In our post-war metropolis, we see that Los Angeles became our new prototype. You'll recall in the late 1800s that Chicago, and into the 1900s, Chicago was our prototype. It was our concentric zone model with our busy downtown area surrounded by a zone of transition. And then as we move away from the downtown area, we experienced decreasing density as yards got bigger, properties got bigger, affluence increased. Los Angeles is very much different than our traditional cities, our traditional industrial cities, and that LA has no center. The metro is about 500 square miles, much bigger than what we found in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Milwaukee. Los Angeles has many different districts. As we're going to see, many of these districts provide opportunities, but it also provides issues. It provides concerns for political and political management of the entity. And LA lacks a comprehensive plan. So it's a series of little hubs, what are also called nuclei, in a metro area. We don't have this downtown area surrounded by predictable land uses like we have in our older cities. LA also wasn't built around a port or a highway. It was built, a port or a railroad. LA was built around a highway. So they had rapid transportation, the use of automobiles, and connecting people to farther distances. But a big concern, again, is this idea of fragmentation, where each of the different entities or nuclei within the LA metro area act in self-serving ways. So what they try to do is promote the tax base, promote the business community, promote the services within all of these different units, all of these different entities within the metro area. So LA is very different than a place like Chicago, again, or Baltimore, or New York. It's fragmented, it's split apart. And it has to do with the way in which LA evolved. Here's a picture from 1910, well over a century ago, of the different communities surrounding Los Angeles. You'll recall in a previous look, we discussed William Mulholland and how he brought water into LA. This was before Los Angeles benefited from that predictable water supply. So during this time, we see all these little communities like Compton, Whittier, Pasadena. Pasadena evolved as a destination early on for people with respiratory ailments and later on as a resort town. Whittier became a place for orange groves, citrus growth. Compton in the 1800s was a destination for people looking to strike it rich in oil or gold, and later on it became a farming community. So over time, all of these units grew outside of LA. But as the 20th century persisted, particularly after World War II, we see how highways and the investment in roads and the investment in the federal government in military bases and airports allowed all these distinct entities to grow into one metro area. So by 1970, again, you see how Los Angeles became a much bigger unit. But again, we recognize communities like Pasadena, Compton, Whittier, Redondo, Long Beach as separate semi-autonomous entities that don't work for an entire Los Angeles city planning. And then by 2010, we see the extent of the LA Metro going well into Ventura County in the northwest, well into San Bernardino County in the northeast, and then southeast into Orange and Riverside counties. As we look at LA, again, urban fragmentation is one of the highlights, one of the key identifying forces here. And that's competing government entities where they're looking for autonomy, right, which allows them to determine their direction, but it also provides weak regional planning. So how do you plan for transportation? How do you address issues, right? While some of our autonomous entities are thriving and have a strong tax and business base and relatively affluent population, some of the other communities like Compton today, some of the other communities that are experiencing issues with lack of transportation connections, poor schools, poverty, crime, drug addiction, those areas are experiencing further decline because of this weak regional planning. We think back to Unit 1 in some of David Harvey's ideas, and the urban fragmentation that exists in Los Angeles further magnifies that idea of uneven development, where growth and prosperity continues to go to areas that are growing and prospering, where areas in decline continue to suffer more because the different entities, the different little nuclei within the metro aren't working together to provide solutions to the urban issues. So Los Angeles, again, serves as our prototype. Early on, defense and aerospace served as a pull, and the weather, the entrepreneurial spirit, the excitement, the newness of this place created a strong attraction from around the country. Later on, Los Angeles, its pull force extended beyond the United States, and it started to attract immigrants from different places, primarily Latin America and East Asia. Los Angeles became what's known as a polyglot city, a city of many languages. Immigration drove the increase, the prevalence of ethnic enclaves and also ethnic economies. An ethnic economy differs from an enclave. In an ethnic economy, all of the businesses are owned, or the vast majority of the businesses are owned by a singular ethnic group, like Koreatown, like Little Ethiopia. So it goes beyond just the majority of the residents. It goes into actually ownership in the businesses. This is an image of all of the different communities within Los Angeles. Again, this idea of a polyglot, many languages. And you can see over time how the city of Los Angeles attracted people from China, Korea, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, the Philippines, Cambodia, and how all of these different communities have established ethnic enclaves and ethnic economies. So if you visit Los Angeles today, the prototype of our modern metropolis, you're going to recognize these distinct communities by their cultural landscape, what's known as a transnational landscape, the blending together of different migrant and immigrant groups to create a new enclave.